This is, I've been told, the track 2 equivalent of the luncheon panel with the ambassadors, so I expect a lot less jargon, a lot less politeness, and a very much more pointed conversation. As is the previous conversations, I will be running this a tight ship. We're going to have 7-minute presentations, and then I hope to have a more fulsome and engaged conversation after that. But I would again ask, and I will repeat, that all of you, when you do interject, that you keep this short, keep it pointed, and keep this thing moving forward. You've got a list of the speakers. You know who they are. If you don't know them personally, you should. They're all a really remarkable and smart group. We'll take the speakers in the order in which they are laid out here. So Jennifer, if you would please lead us off.
Great, well thank you very much. And it is a real honor to be here, so thank you so much to the organizers and everybody that's made it here today. Certainly the panel after lunch is not necessarily easy, so I'm certainly sure that Professor Padalano will at least keep you entertained. I guess one of the things I wanted to start with is often the discussion around what's happening in the South China Sea gets lost in an academic debate. And that is important, but I think that at the forefront of our mind should be the lives that are at risk at sea every single day. I think sometimes we forget that. Certainly for me, as an Australian, I look with great concern at some of the incidents that have involved Australian aircraft and ships, both in the South China Sea and East Asia. And I think that in some elements, you know, we can talk on one hand about competing claims and the legality of that, and that is a really important conversation. It's obviously driving some of the aggression in the region. But whatever the competing claims, that does not justify some of the unprofessional, aggressive behaviour that we're seeing on the waters. And certainly I want to kind of frame my thinking in terms of that. We are seeing lives put at risk fairly regularly, and we did see earlier this year a Filipino sailor actually lose a finger. That stuff is really, really significant. I wanted to address the idea in terms of external actors. I agree with Professor Padalano's comments yesterday that I think that's a really unhelpful narrative. I think certainly countries such as Australia, which would define ourselves as part of the Pacific, but also part of Asia and also part of the Indian Ocean, we like to have it 3 different ways, we are invested in the South China Sea because it is important to our own national interests. Of course, issues such as the rules-based order and the rule of law are important, and you'll hear that mentioned by Australia quite frequently. But when you look at Australia's position, 2/3 of Australia's trade comes through the South China Sea. So from an economic perspective, the stability in the South China Sea is incredibly important to us, and that is why you see Australia so invested in the region. And it's not a new comment. I know that we had some presentations yesterday that mapped out the increase in military activities in the region. I would question some of that data. But from an Australian perspective, we have been operating in the South China Sea for a very, very long time, and for those reasons, because it is important to us from an economic perspective. More broadly though, Australia is the 3rd largest exclusive economic zone in the world. And Australia has benefited substantially, as have many of the countries represented here, from the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea. So it is important to us that it is upheld and that it's not abused by countries just because they hold power. It's interesting to see the evolution of how Australia has engaged on this problem in the South China Sea. We heard the Australian ambassador today talk about the increase in the relationship between Australia and the Philippines. Australia and the Philippines have had a long-standing relationship, but of course the aggressive behaviour and bullying behaviour that China has displayed towards the Philippines in the West Philippine Sea has made that relationship closer. And that's actually not an easy conversation for Australia, because actually for Australia the relationship with China matters a whole lot too, and it is a really difficult position to be in. China is of course Australia's biggest trading partner, and in fact, probably little known in this room, Australia and China historically are comprehensive strategic partners. But Australia has had to make that difficult choice in coming out and calling out China's behaviour increasingly vocally, because it undermines Australia's own interest to see that occurring. And of course, Australia has been subject to some of the aggressive and what I would deem as unprofessional behaviour from China in the region. I mentioned yesterday some examples. There are a number of other examples where Australian sailors have been put at risk and in fact injured in the region. So I think all of that goes to show why Australia cares, why we consider ourselves an important stakeholder in the region, and why we would push against the idea of external actors. I'm getting the 3-minute go, and I promised that I would finish on time, so I just want to kind of talk about the South China Sea in terms of the global context as well. We did have the ambassadors this morning mention it, but I think it's important to reiterate when we're talking about issues in the South China Sea. I don't think that we should talk about them as an isolated issue. They're not. They are linked to issues greater in the region and global issues, where we're seeing states increasingly use use of force. And I know there's been a discussion around definitions, a wonderful academic discussion, but I'll tell you what, right now, a sailor on a ship who gets a high-powered water cannon placed at them or is rammed by another ship probably views that as use of force from the other ship. And so we are seeing the increasing use of state power. And so I think that we need to also view these incidents as part of the greater concern and really try and promote how we address that more broadly. And I think I would like to highlight, in my last minute, how well I think the Philippines have done. I think it has been brave and courageous to highlight the behaviour that China has conducted in the West Philippine Sea. For Australia itself, it was quite a journey to start publicising to our public the incidents that were occurring, the harassment of our ships and aircraft in the region, which did not start in 2022 when Australia started publicising it. It started much earlier. So given I'm getting my time, I think I'll leave my remarks there, but look forward to the questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. And now the ever-intriguing and provocative Brahma Chalani.
Well, thank you. I've been attending South China Sea meetings for over 10 years. In that period, the core issues haven't changed, but the ground realities have changed fundamentally, placing South China Sea at the center of international maritime challenges. The role of external players is clearly important, especially if the South China Sea is to remain free and open. South China Sea, as we all know, is a critical shipping lifeline for the global economy, and strategically too, it's a very important corridor, the main corridor between the Pacific and Indian Oceans. The external players in the Indian Ocean region in particular have an important role to play, including Australia, Japan, India, United States, but also other players like South Korea. India is the closest neighbor of South China Sea because India's sea frontiers extend to the entrance of the South China Sea. And whatever happens in the South China Sea will directly impinge on India's maritime interests. But in terms of external players, the role of the United States is clearly the most important for two reasons. One, the US has more to lose than the other external players if the South China Sea were to come under Chinese hegemony. At stake is America's primacy in the Indo-Pacific region. The second reason is that among the claimant states in the South China Sea, the US has a treaty ally, the Philippines. And just this year, from President Biden down, including the Secretary of State, the National Security Advisor, have all said publicly that the US commitment to the Philippines under the Mutual Defense Treaty is, quote unquote, ironclad. So the US shoulders an important responsibility. And if the perception grows that the US is unwilling to go beyond mere statements of support for the Philippines, then even as Philippines' control of areas within its EEZ erodes, this could potentially have a bearing on the assessment of other allies about the US commitment or about the reliability of US commitment to their defense. But it's important to remember that the key challenge that all external players face in relation to the South China Sea is that the incremental change there is happening through the fusion of hybrid warfare and gray zone tactics. Dealing with this challenge is not an easy one because this has been accomplished below the threshold of armed conflict. But the success in changing the status quo in the South China Sea is creating what I would call a South China Sea model that is sought to be replicated elsewhere, from the East China Sea to the Himalayas. For example, the revisionism in the Himalayas has not spared even Bhutan. Bhutan is so tiny that it's difficult to locate Bhutan in a map of Asia. In other words, the revisionism in the South China Sea is imposing costs not just on the states in this part of the world, but is also imposing costs on states located beyond this region. And this challenge in the South China Sea is compounded by the fact that China's expansive claims are based not on international law, but on its revisionist history. In international law, a territorial claim has to be based on continuous and peaceful exercise of sovereignty over the territory concerned. The paradox is this, that China has been breaching international law through its expansionism in order to assert its claims and rights under international law. In other words, it's not blind to international law. It's seeking to legitimize its claims, and that's the reason why it's doing what it is doing. China knows that possession is 9/10 of the law, and it has a long history to know this. For example, you take the annexation of Tibet. Who today talks about the legality or otherwise of the annexation of Tibet? It's not even an issue in academic discourse. Similarly, if you look at the discourse about South China Sea, how it has changed. Nobody's talking about a return to status quo ante. Nobody's talking about a rollback of Chinese encroachments, forward military presence, its forward military outposts. No, the discourse is about how to prevent further encroachments and further change of the status quo. So China knows that possession is 9/10 of the law, and it's seeking to complete the 10th part of its plan. Dialogue and diplomacy normally are important to peacefully resolve disputes between countries, but that is grounded on the willingness of the parties to negotiate in order to narrow their differences over their interpretation of specific provisions of international law or customary international law. But in the South China Sea, the situation does not lend itself for negotiations in order to apply the principles of international law. A rules-based order, no doubt, is essential for regional peace and security. But I want to add a note of realism that the future of the South China Sea is unlikely to be decided by international rules and norms. In fact, the Philippines has become a test case for how we prevent the South China Sea from being governed by Chinese rules.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Furuya Kentaro.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am Captain Kentaro Furuya of the Japanese Coast Guard. I am teaching at National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies, Keio Universities, and in Japanese Coast Guard Academy. Firstly, I'd like to thank for conveners having me for this important conference. And my humble contribution to this panel is Japan's contribution to a more rule-based South China Sea role of external partners. The South China Sea is currently experiencing a gray zone situations where the security environment is tense, but falls short of an armed conflict. Countries such as Vietnam, Philippines, Malaysia, and Indonesia frequently face challenges to their maritime security from vessels employing aggressive tactics, including the use of water cannons, lasers, and other non-lethal weapons. In this volatile environment, external partners play a crucial role in enforcing a rule-based international order and support those nations' maritime safety and security in their regions. And given the situations, what the role of external players can play in more rule-based international order? A key role is to assist the countries bordering the South China Sea in strengthening their ocean governance capabilities. Here, I'd like to outline 3 essential policies that Japan has advanced, especially with the Philippines: the diplomacy, the capacity building, and joint operation and exercises. Firstly, the diplomatic engagement with diplomacy. In addition to the regional and global dialogues among Coast Guard agencies, such as the head of Asian Coast Guard Agencies meeting or the Coast Guard Global Summit that yesterday Bartholomew Canose had mentioned, Japan, along with partners like the United States and the European Union, has actively engaged in a diplomatic effort to support transparency and rule-based international order in the South China Sea. For example, Japan supports the Philippines initiative to report and share the detail of incidents in the region by promptly issuing diplomatic notes. This cooperation not only bolsters the Philippines' confidence, but also raises global awareness of these aggressive actions, enabling other countries to respond quickly and reinforcing the rule of law. This diplomatic support does more than draw attention to the issues. It fosters a strong, united response among nations that discourage aggressive actions and promote collaboration on ocean governance. And second, strengthening capacities by asset provision and human resource development. To enhance these countries' capabilities to respond to maritime threats, Japan has provided essential assets to the regional states. Key contributions include 10 44-meter class and 2 97-meter class cutters to the Philippine Coast Guard, with a plan to deliver an additional 5 97-meter class cutters underway. Beyond ships, Japan has initiated programs to improve surveillance capability by providing the terrestrial radar system, extending the reach of the Philippine maritime domain awareness across its expansive exclusive economic zones. This asset support goes beyond addressing immediate security needs, laying the foundation for sustainable long-term monitoring and presence and response capabilities, essential for safeguarding the region. And in terms of the capacity building for the by the human resource development, Japanese government is committed to developing human resources. Japan Coast Guard Mobile Cooperation Team, or the MCT, had visited 7 times in 2023. It means that once in 2 months to train the PCG officers and enlisted personnel in various Coast Guard operations. These include boat operations, engine maintenance, search and rescue, martial arts for arrest, and VBSS, visit boat search and seizure operations. More importantly, in addition to this tactical and operational level training, Japan offers promising officers the chance to pursue postgraduate studies in maritime safety and security policy formulation at the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies, preparing future leaders of regional Coast Guard agencies. And then finally, the Japanese joint operations and exercises. JCG has been dispatching its cutters to Indo-Pacific regions. Last year, the multiple cutters were dispatched to Southeast Asia for joint exercises, including counter-piracy, search and rescue, and oil spill response. Notably, some of these exercises were conducted jointly with the United States Coast Guard, focusing on the developing practical skills and operational procedures at sea, rather than theoretical desk-based seminars. These joint exercises are invaluable in enhancing the ability to enforce maritime laws effectively, thereby delivering lasting benefits for regional stability. These exercises, coupled with asset provision and training and educational initiatives at different levels, will further enhance the capability of enhanced maritime laws and responding effectively to incidents in accordance with international law, creating enduring benefits for regional stability. In my conclusion, Japan's comprehensive support, diplomatic capacity building, and joint exercises and operations demonstrates that positive impact external partners can have on maritime governance in this region. By supporting transparency, enhancing capability, and conducting joint exercises, Japan contributes to a sustainable, rule-based order in the South China Sea. As we look ahead, we encourage more partners to contribute resources, training, and diplomatic support, building a collaborative force for stable and rule-based international order in the South China Sea. With broader international commitments, these collective efforts deter assertive actions and create an environment that affords maritime law and encourage regional cooperation. In this context, I'm very happy that in previous sessions, the many ambassadors talk about collaboration positively. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Furuya-san. And now the ever incisive, enlightening, and dapper Alessio Catalano.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for the gracious invitation and the opportunity to join this enlightening conversation. I will follow up on Furuya-sensei's words about cooperation and talk a little bit about partnerships in maritime security. And in my remarks, I have fundamentally 3 points, because if we want to talk about partnership in maritime security, we need to first acknowledge, and I think that came across very strongly in the last couple of days, the changing character of maritime security. What do we mean by that? Secondly, that invites a reflection of the shift towards what are the opportunities for partnerships? What should we be thinking about in order to inject and live up to the changing character of maritime security? And last point will be an example that UK is directly involved into as a way to suggest way forward. So let's talk a little bit about this shifting, the changing character of maritime security. It seems to me that long gone are the days when we used to talk about the chasing pirates and thinking about the human and trafficking as the things that would bring us together. Maritime cooperation 10 years ago was predominantly a positive, inclusive endeavor. And we shifted that, and the emphasis in the last couple of days has been very much on governance, not so much maintaining good order at sea, implementing how we deal with this set of challenges, and more about ascertaining national sovereign rights as a way to manifest your capacity for governance. That is a significant shift. And in terms of what it entails for maritime security, it seems to me that it brings about this very important point of agency. The shift is not how we get together to do stuff, it's to prove that we are responsible in specific portions of the ocean. Coastal states are responsible for implementing their own sovereign rights. And so the rule-based order and the role of maritime security seems to be shifting a lot more about empowering coastal states to have their voice heard and their sovereign rights ascertained through governance. What does that mean, though, in terms of how we do cooperation? I think it invites a certain shift in what we mean by cooperating together. Over the last decade or so, and Furuya-sensei mentioned this quite eloquently just moments ago, practical cooperation around improving standards of practice have been very much at the forefront of the way in which we work together. And when it comes to European perspectives, perhaps no example is better than the one presented by the Crimario 2 initiative. It's a classic example of focusing on practical activities to improve standards in providing capacity building. Now, this is still an invaluable opportunity for cooperation, but I think it misses out on what really is needed, and that is the capacity to develop together a shared vocabulary to inform the grammar of maritime security today. In other words, we are only stronger as a community of practice of maritime security in the South China Sea as well as anywhere else if we develop voices that are articulated on a vocabulary that we all understand and around a grammar that we all share. Put it this way, we need to start to invest into opportunities for cooperation that allow us to make sure that we understand what the recipe book around maritime security is, so that we can decide, even if we have daily menus at the national level that are different, how to relate with each other. Sorry, I went all Italian on this metaphor. This leads me to my third point. So what should we do therefore? And here I'd like to draw upon the example, recent example that is currently sort of taking place between the UK and India, in terms of seeking to develop the first regional maritime security center of excellence. Don't go away, Admiral Chavan. Which the King's College London and the National Maritime Foundation are pursuing on behalf of our respective governments. The idea behind the Center of Excellence is precisely to position itself in that middle ground, a place that is above the operational space, and it is very much designed for building the long-term capacity to have shared vocabulary, shared grammar, in which we articulate different voices from across the region. It aims to be an intellectual lighthouse where different perspectives can be harnessed together so that we make sure that there is increased resilience in the maritime security landscape through an understanding of different approaches to sovereign rights and governance. The vision around this is for an institution that is inclusive, that convenes as many actors in the region as is possible, and it is multi-stakeholders. This is not just about governments, coast guards. It is also, as it was mentioned a couple of days ago, about having private sector, shipping companies, multilateral organizations. It needs to bring together the different stakeholders in order to ensure that whatever it is, the type of frameworks for governance, as well as how we decided to implement it, are as regionally owned and as wide as possible. Within this context, the focus of the Center of Excellence is in the Indian Ocean to begin with, but if the story is starting with the Indian Ocean, it does not need to end about the Indian Ocean. And in that sense, therefore, I do open to your reflection the opportunity as we continue to create this first intellectual lighthouse to reconceptualize how maritime security can be the beginning of further cooperation, the extent to which many others from across the South China Sea can come and join, have their voice heard, and together develop that sense of national sovereign rights so essential to continue to inform governance at sea as we move forward. Thank you very much.
Never disappointing. Thank you very much. Our last speaker is Greg Poling from the always invaluable AMTI. Greg?
Thank you, Brad. I note that I was not invaluable and dapper, but that's all right. So we have heard a lot over the last 2 days about issues related to deterrence, capacity building, the U.S.-Philippine alliance, and that's my day job, so I'm not going to do that on this panel because it dominates the news every day here and often in the U.S., issues around the EDCA sites, the networking of U.S.-Philippine alliance, issues around Second Thomas. Happy to talk about all of that, as well as how it might change in January in the Q&A. But what I'd like to focus on in my short few minutes is to pick up on the thread that Justice Carpio left yesterday, which was how can external partners, the U.S. and all those represented here on the panel, helped support the Philippines in imposing reputational and diplomatic cost on Beijing through arbitrations and international bodies, so that China eventually chooses to seek compromise in the South China Sea in good faith, something it has not done, despite the Code of Conduct negotiations now being 26 years old, legally able to rent a car in the United States, and having zero progress in that time. And to do that, I also want to apologize in advance to Alessio. I'm going to talk about the UK as another example of an imperial power defeated by a small state through UN bodies. I do that to be colorful, not to lay out any clear condemnations of British policy, but because I think it helps highlight how the UN system interacts with international courts in ways that the Philippines has not yet fully explored. We all know that the Philippines won an arbitral case before the PCA in 2016. And then the Philippines effectively wasted 6 years not advocating for that case. The Marcos administration has tried to reverse that process, has tried to now go around the world getting international support, and the US, Japan, Europe, Australia have all been quite supportive of that effort. One step that gets talked about a fair bit in kind of the academic and op-ed discourse is the idea of, okay, what next? Why not file a General Assembly resolution calling for compliance with the 2016 arbitral award, and then why not file a second case? And so far, the Department of Foreign Affairs here has been hesitant to do that out of fear that it would lose any such vote in the UN based on a presumption that China is sui generis. Even if UN votes are willing to go against Russia and the US and the UK and others, they would never go against China. And I would push back against that conception. So I think obviously we can all talk about the Nicaragua case in the ICJ, the famous example of the US having lost multiple UN votes until it finally, said uncle and agreed to give Nicaragua what it had won. And that took roughly a decade. But the more relevant example now is the case of Mauritius this year finally compelling the UK to agree to hand over the Chagos Archipelago through a negotiation. Much like the Philippines, Mauritius won a narrowly defined, unclosed decision through the Permanent Court of Arbitration in 2015, which ruled that maritime protected areas around the Chagos Archipelago by the UK were illegal. Mauritius then spun that out 2 years later into a UN General Assembly resolution calling for the overall issue of sovereignty to be forwarded to the ICJ, International Court of Justice, for an advisory opinion. And it won that vote. The vote in 2017 in the UN was 94 in favor, 15 against, and 84 abstentions. So when Philippine officials say that they don't have the votes in the UN, what they actually mean, I think, is that they don't have a majority of votes. That most, or at least a plurality of countries in the UN would probably abstain in any vote condemning China. And that's probably right, but that doesn't matter. A victory is a victory, and the case would then go to the ICJ. In this case, that could be a vote simply calling for compliance with the 2016 award. It could be a vote seeking an ICJ advisory opinion that China's current behavior amounts to a threat or use of force in violation of the UN Charter. Heck, it could be seeking an ICJ advisory opinion that China's occupation of Mischief Reef is illegal and must end immediately based on 2016 arbitration. All three of those votes, the Philippines would win in the UN General Assembly. In the case of Mauritius, the ICJ took up the case in 2017, came out with a ruling in 2019. That year, Mauritius went back to the UN General Assembly seeking a vote demanding that the UK comply with the ICJ decision. That time, Mauritius won 116 to 6, which means more than a 20-vote swing based on the ICJ advisory opinion. And then, 7 years later, and a 2021 ITLOS decision in between, the UK finally agreed to negotiate the sovereignty of the Chagos Archipelago. If we were to apply similar principles in the case of the Philippines, we already have 26 countries publicly stating that China must comply with the award. Only 7 member states of the UN have said China should not. And I would toss out 2 of those, Montenegro and Vanuatu, as likely abstentions, because they did that for very peculiar reasons. If we then look at the likely voting behavior of states based on other controversial boats, Russia-related, for instance. And the U.S. State Department puts out an annual report to this effect that you can look at. The most likely model that I can come up with is that the Philippines wins roughly 86 votes to 37, with about 73 abstentions. Even the most conservative possible number I can come up with, which would be that the Philippines only wins those countries already on the record, plus those countries that vote with the US and Europe more than 90% of the time, it still wins 57 to 37 with 102 abstentions. There is simply no way that you can come up with compelling numbers that suggest that the Philippines could lose a vote tomorrow in the UN General Assembly. And then it would win by more and more and more. And the point here for the international community in the US is that despite US complaints about the UN, there is no country that has more weight in the UN, that is able to better lobby and knuckle down on states to vote the way they want. The US, Japan, and Europe would play a vital role in whipping these votes. And none of this means that Xi Jinping suddenly wakes up tomorrow and says, "You got me. It's time to negotiate a fair code of conduct." But it does begin to lay the groundwork for future Chinese leadership, and it unfortunately will be future Chinese leadership, to seek a diplomatic off-ramp, much like the US, Russia, the UK, and every other state who loses a major arbitration eventually does, but only if the Philippines can make this a continuous imposition of cost, not a single win in 2016. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. Quick applause for all of the panelists for very succinct, excellent presentations. Number one, I did call the AMTI invaluable, Greg, and I can't very well call you dapper when you're not even wearing a tie, as opposed to Alessia, so there we go. I see several placards coming up, thank you. I would ask again, as everybody, to be somewhat succinct. I would ask, I think, to focus again very much on the topic, and I want to thank you, Greg, on that for your last comment, for sort of taking in this notion of external partners more broadly conceptualized, I think. And I do want to make sure that that is what this session is about. What are these partnerships for? And one of the questions I want to put on the table before I start going to the speakers is, what are our benchmarks for success in evaluating the partnerships? And the other thing I want to do for particularly our Southeast Asian participants, because I'd like to have some input from you as well, is we do not have a Southeast Asian on this panel. Who do you look to in addition to the ones that are very much headlined here? Who would you see as being preferred partners, both in general, I suppose, as well as in terms of specific applications and specific ways to help build capacity within the Philippines and the South China Sea more broadly? And is there a way perhaps to shift the emphasis depending upon what the particular area of capacity building we're discussing? So with that, please ask your questions more succinctly than my comment just was. Mr. Blandon, I believe I have you first.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is addressed to either Professor Palatano or Gregory Pauling, so either or both of the two can answer. When we talk about capacity building in the area, I'd like to draw a comparison with the NISA workshop to which I was blessed to attend in Thailand recently. And we had Coast Guard, for example, from all the Indian Ocean, and they told us, they told the panel, that they are faced with so many options with the IPMDA or the European Union solution, or with proposal from companies or from satellite internet startups and so on, and they don't know what to do. And so some countries go for the government level solution, some go for the company solution, some actually go for accumulation of actually different solutions. So there's a great deal of confusion at some point whether which solution is the best and what kind of provider is the best. Is a government best? Is a union best, like European Union? Is a company best? What would you say could be a solution to help these countries actually make sense of all the options that are at their disposal? Thank you.
And I am going to take several questions before we go to speakers, so please. Is that it? Ms. Yi, please.
Thank you. This is Sophie Wu Shaoyin from Granville Institution from Beijing, China. So I have 2 comments and 1 question. The first comment is on what Professor Palatano had brought up, the different approaches to understandings and interpretation. And I think that is important because From my reflection from the conferences over these 2 days, we are nowhere near in convincing each other of our own objectives and approaches to understanding and interpreting the disputes and the crisis. So it is very important that we have reached a consensus on the language that are used and the basic grounds that we can adopt to interpret the crisis and the disputes and the differences that everyone could reach a consensus on. So I think personal reflection on that is being a Chinese national, I felt like China is being blamed as guilty for being a regional actor with adequate military, economic, and political power in line with its global status. I think it's important to recognize that China has risen as a global power, and we also need to recognize that China's growth in economic, military, and political power is inadequate to its global status growth. So the mutual respect is important. So that comes to my question. China has adopted a consistent South China Sea policy to adopt bilateral dialogues and communications to peacefully resolve disputes and conflicts. So what are the implications for the external factors, the third party, even the fourth and fifth parties, as we witnessed from the speeches from the ambassadors this morning, that the third party factor in China's efforts to continue its bilateral resolvements of the disputes? What are the implications, and why is it a barrier for China to continue its bilateral efforts? Thank you.
Thank you, and don't forget, if you're directing your question to someone in particular, please let us know. Mr. Castillo.
Good afternoon. I'm Santiago Castillo. I'm with the Pacific Forum's Young Leaders Delegation, and I used to be with the Philippine government as a researcher on security matters. I have a question that's also a thought process, and this is for all the speakers, and thank you for your insights. We all agree that might makes right is not the way, and how the way China's behaving in the South China Sea is perhaps that example. But we also understand that China understands and adheres that might does give a message. But so can we say that us, like as external partners and those in a consensus, can we say that might, under the auspices of an international rules-based order, in consensus, the countries that want to uphold such order is more right and is actually also the way forward? Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Galang.
Thank you, sir. My question is for Captain Furuya and Mr. Poling. What are the prospects of the commitments made to the Philippines under the Japan-Philippines U.S. Trilateral Summit under the incoming Trump administration, particularly with respect to the Luzon Economic Corridor and the Coast Guard exercises? Thank you.
Let's go to the speakers. We'll start, Alessio, and work our way down, please.
So a couple of quick points. Who does the best partnerships? I think there is no one-size-fits-all. As I was saying earlier, it depends very much on the different aspects. So maritime security is like a cake. You cut it, and there's different layers, from the tactical to the operational to the conceptual space. And I think in that sense, the real question that one wants to address is not so much who is best at providing, but what particular aspects of the maritime security slice you want to address. And then based on that, I think different actors will serve different purposes. In particular, insofar as the Center of Excellence for Regional Maritime Security that we're developing, we're benchmarking ourselves in the space of intellectual, if you want, academic standards in order to level and close the gap between the theoretical, abstract, rule-based order that comes with starting to read UNCLOS and its different articles and close it with the more sort of like a national level application of that. At the moment, as we've learned in the last 2 days, there are very different perspectives on what governance and how you apply
governance comes about. So insofar as I'm concerned, a place like a Center of Excellence duty is to level the game in terms of our shared understanding of what the vocabulary means, and then close the gap in the way in which we understand each other's differences in implementation. So no size fit at all. Different organizations will do different things. I think Asiwa and Krimario too have been doing a fantastic job in terms of standards of practice, but that's very much in the operational space. From my perspective, we are in a moment in which, unless we start engaging the higher conceptual, notional level of what it means to implement governance, we will continue to do a lot of tactical and operational cooperation and capacity building with very little result in terms of reducing tensions and increasing resilience. On the second question about the China being blamed and what is sort of the role for external parties, I think the problem, at least the way I approach it, is not, everybody's entitled to their own opinion, so long as their opinion is A, consistent with the set of rules and norms to which one is prescribed to, and there is an unclarity on how certain concepts used in the South China Sea by China are consistent or indeed compliant with the norms and regulations that China itself has signed up to through UNCLOS. And the second thing is the modality. How do you engage over that? Use of force should not be the natural port of call to sort out the differences. Hence the idea that perhaps part of this needs to be sorted out more clearly in terms of the notions that we use. Peter, the last couple of days, has asked to every single Chinese speaker, what do you mean by 9-line? What should we take that? It didn't get a proper answer to it. And by the way, the 2016 arbitration threw it out of the door because it's not a legal concept. So we should stop using this concept that have absolutely no logic whatsoever in the frameworks that we're all signed up to, and let's start using the notions and frameworks and concepts in the rule-based frameworks that we're all signed up to, and start to argue our difference through those lenses. But we can only do that if we all come together and we increase in an inclusive fashion what we mean and how we understand these fundamental frameworks. Over.
I'll make a general comment. It's good to find ways to ensure that unilateralism in the South China Sea is no longer cost-free. So it's definitely, we need to look at diplomatic, political, and other options to ensure that cost-free expansionism ceases. But we have to recognize that time is not on our side. Every year brings creation of new facts on the ground. And if we recognize that, we have to look at ways where costs can be imposed in a comprised time frame. Otherwise, expansionism will remain cost-free.
Somehow responding to the Benjamin's question, in case of Japanese Coast Guard, we dispatch prior to the hosting seminars and joint exercises in order to make a tailor-made, the capacity building programs. So it means that we are not making a ready-made capacity building program, but we need to look for what is necessary for the particular countries prior to the hosting the seminars. And in other cases, our resources are so limited, so we might need to consider what asset we have or what resources we have, and then decide what kind of the lectures or the joint exercise we can do while dispatching our Coast Guard assets. And then again, slightly responding to Yi's comment, well, I think the convincing is so challenging under the international atmosphere right now. However, we need to step one step forward. Why don't you do that? This is my opinion. And how do you do that? To try to understand what others might think. I was educated in Japan and Sweden and UK. And in Sweden and UK, the atmosphere was really international. There are many friends in different countries, including China. Why don't you try to understand the different interpretation by different countries? I think that is the first step. And also, this is not only you, but also us. We need to try to understand what you interpret particular provisions of international law, including the law of the sea. And responding to the Garant's question, well, unfortunately, I'm not very much familiar with the recent economic corridor or what you have said, but we have variety of, in terms of the Coast Guard operation, we have variety of, the options that the Philippines can take. We started our capacity building program from hydrographic survey, creation of navigational chart, and traffic safety management, and BTS, vessel traffic safety management, and then the search and rescue, oil spill response, and law enforcement in terms of smuggling of drugs and, the illegal migrants and piracy, illegal, and illegal operation of the fishery. All those are, variety of things. So maybe we can, my prospect is that we are going to deepen our, mutual relationship in future. Thank you.
Greg?
Thanks. So first, to Missy, I don't think that anybody over the last 2 days has blamed China for its power, for becoming a leader on the world stage. What China's being blamed for is using that power to deprive its neighbors of their rights and their livelihoods, using that power either for intentional collisions or the risk of collisions, risking the lives of sailors and airmen from across the Indo-Pacific over the waters and airspace of both the South China Sea and the East China Sea, and in general trying to overturn a body of treaty law that China itself helped negotiate and now believes no longer applies because China has become more powerful than it was when it first helped negotiate those rules in the 70s. I would also argue you cannot bilaterally negotiate a multilateral dispute, nor has China shown any willingness to negotiate in good faith for more than 20 years. It has built artificial islands, it's militarized them, it has collided with Filipinos left and right, all while saying, why aren't we negotiating? And I don't think that that is a good faith effort. To Nico, look, I'm cautiously optimistic about what happens after January. Specifically on the Luzon Economic Corridor, we should probably not call it the PGII, the Luzon Economic Corridor, once Trump comes into power. But if you look at some of the components, it was under the Trump administration that the U.S. helped orchestrate the rescue of Subic when Hanjin collapsed. There's no reason to think that he wouldn't continue to pursue trilateral cooperation with Japan in developing Subic, one of the 3 keys of the Luzon Economic Corridor. Also no reason to think he wouldn't help support the semiconductor industry, and you need energy. Now we'll have to tweak the clean energy part of that, but that gets you all 3 pieces of the Luzon Economic Corridor. You also have, the new DFC office being set up here. The DFC was organized under the Trump administration. So there's a lot of components you can pick up and kind of stamp Trump 2025 on it, and it'll still be the Luzon Economic Corridor under a different name.
Jennifer?
Thank you so much. Brad, I don't think anyone's actually answered your question, so I'll give you a quick comment. Look, I think in terms of the measurement of success, it's proving that this isn't just a moment or a fleeting moment of support. So sustainable support to countries that are being bullied by China in the South China Sea. And I'm sorry if that's a confronting term, but it's just truthful. A breadth of support so that goes well into a deep relationship, and then making sure that that support continues to grow and can be relied upon when things become more tense. Benjamin, in terms of your question about capacity building and coordination, look, I do understand, and I previously worked in capacity building in the Indian Ocean and heard this a lot. There is probably a good example in the Indian Ocean, which is the Djibouti Code of Conduct, where they have tried to get different organizations providing capacity building to just highlight what they're doing and try and deconflict in a way. I would just correct on one point though, the Indo-Pacific Maritime Domain Awareness under the Quad, which at the moment is the provision of RF data, is actually compatible with things like Sea Vision, which is provided by the US. So I don't see it at odds with the other MDA capabilities that are provided. It was specifically designed to be compatible. Monsieur, look, thank you so much for being here. I actually meant to say in my remarks that it is really pleasing to be at a conference that has representation from China. Too often we have conferences where we talk about this problem and Chinese personnel are not represented. And I think that's really important because it is really important to have a conversation. I'm going to give a really bad analogy though in terms of explaining the relationship. If you're going out for dinner and you put on a dress and it looks really ugly, a good friend would tell you it looks really ugly, a bad friend would tell you you look great and let you embarrass yourself. And I really think, as I mentioned before, in Australia's position is really difficult, and I think it's been a long journey to getting to the point of calling out China's behaviour in the South China Sea, China's behaviour to Australian men and women service people, and China's coercion of Australia. That is a difficult position because actually China and Australia have historically had quite a good relationship, and as I mentioned before, they are strategic partners. But that is in response to China's behaviour towards Australia and Australia's partners. And so it's difficult to try and gloss over that, but I do agree that it's really important to try and discuss and come to an understanding when we can.
Thank you. I have about 10 placards. I have 20 minutes, and I want to get some comments. And so I'm going to ask everyone to be succinct. And I do want to, having now violate that, abuse the prerogative of the chair and just say to Professor Yi, I don't think anyone resents China's rise. China has every right to become a powerful nation. The questions that we are debating here and the issues that surround these conversations are about the use of China's power. Yeah. So I'll leave it at that. Now, Ray.
Thank you. My question is for Professor Chalani. As far as I'm aware, and I'm happy to be corrected on this, but I'm aware of exactly one ASEAN maritime exercise in the 9-dash line area, and that was one conducted with India in May of last year, the ASEAN-India maritime exercise. So that seems to be a really useful way for India to engage with ASEAN and help ASEAN to assert itself a little bit. I wonder if there are more of those planned. Thank you.
John Bradford.
Sure. My question is to Greg Poling. I thought your assessment of how a vote might go in the UN General Assembly was really useful in the aggregate. I appreciate that. It's not something I thought through. And if there's any person that has the data to assemble it, it's you. So great. But it got me thinking, and I'm wondering, you showed us how you can get the votes, but isn't who abstains or who votes against a critical question? If there are key players that vote against the Philippines' position, or if such a vote were to highlight divisions in ASEAN, could that actually be a situation that's worse than where we are today? Thanks.
Beck, you don't want to follow up? Very good.
Good afternoon. I'm Michaela Van Hoven, based in Hawaii. My question is for Mr. Poling. You briefly touched on it already, but as the United States transitions into a second Trump term, I wanted to ask how you would anticipate an America First rhetoric affecting the United States' engagement with South China Sea issues and with its partnerships in the Asia Pacific, particularly in terms of defense spending contributions and so-called burden sharing with Southeast Asian allies, and if we should expect changes in diplomatic strategy in the region.
As interesting as that question is, since it's been raised several times, and I'm sorry, Michaela, I think that's just such blatantly speculative that it really is, I'm not sure it's the most productive use of our time when the clock is running short. So I just want to, I appreciate that, but I just don't think we're going to get to this group. Kanahara-san.
Thank you, sir. My question is addressed to Captain Furuya. And in building, assisting, and supporting relationship with other states, one important issue from the perspective of international law is how to seek a balance between respect for sovereignty of the state supported and effective, efficient support to be realized. Too much assistance, too much support could be an infringement of the sovereignty of the state assisted, supported. As you know well, Japan has experienced this difficult balancing in the case of cooperation with bordering countries of Malacca and Singapore Straits. If you have, would you please give us a concrete example which is really relevant to this point of mine? Thank you.
Mr. Espina.
Thank you so much. My first question is for Jen Parker. The second one is for Captain Furuya.
And you are?
Joshua Espina from the Philippines. All right. So for Jen Parker, my question is this. So some RAN vessels are aging by 2030. So according to your defense review, you're willing to double down on these things to chase the timeline by 2040s. And China knows this well. So my question is, what sort of measures does Canberra take to ensure the credibility of your presence? For Captain Furuya, sir, how does Japan do a delicate balance in its defense of the home islands against three threats, PRC, North Korea, and Russia, with its increasing commitment to the South China Sea? Thank you.
Professor Do.
Yes, my question first to Professor Alesso Papalatano. So why we have to use the terms that too abstract, rules-based orders? When we come back just to the integrity of UNCLOS against the use of force, against violence, something that more easier for people understand. And the second one, we talk about, general things like support for UNCLOS or rule-based order. Why come down to the specific thing against the Nine-Dash-Line claims, against force share claim, and against any kind of violent activities? I think that it will be easier and it's more conversion for other people to understand. Thank you.
I want to take Mr. Asavada and Mr. Cartuchello, the last two. I've got other placards up, but you've all spoken at least once already. So we'll do this, go to the speakers. If we've got time, we get back to you.
Sure. Thank you so much. My name is Rocco Cartuchello with the Young Leaders Program, and I want to thank the panelists for their contributions, but also to Pacific Forum for providing us young leaders the opportunity to engage with such a diverse array of experts. So my question is to Gregory Poling, but I would appreciate if other panelists would provide their input as well. It has more to do with the sustainability of fishing and the disruption of island building in the South China Sea. I think, as Ambassador Carlson mentioned, 12% of the world's fish supply comes from the South China Sea. But I feel that it is also important to mention the nature of this supply chain, especially with regards to unsustainable fishing practices like IUU fishing, which threatens the already fragile and rapidly disappearing ecosystem and the region's food security overall. And island building has also been known to disrupt fishing migratory behavior and destroy surrounding reef ecosystems. So when we discuss the South China Sea issue at length, I fear this issue in particular is left out, yet stands to affect us all. So I'd really appreciate your insights on just how devastating these practices have been for the environment and what role, if any, can international organizations play on these issues. Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Athawat Aswanada. I'm a Young Leader Program, Pacific Forum, but I'm from Thailand as well. So first of all, I want to answer your question. You posed the question to the audience, and I think it's good to start with that. So I think for Southeast Asian countries, we acknowledge three things. First, many countries in the panel are external power. We acknowledge that. The second, they are necessarily external power. Third, why they are necessary is that Southeast Asian nations are weaker, smaller compared to China. As a result, bilateralism should not be a good choice for dealing with the problems. That's why we need to rely on external power to balance against the powerful countries. And that's boiled down to one strategy of Southeast Asian nation, that is hedging strategy. That is my brief answer to your questions. And I have one question to pose back to the panel. So Southeast Asia, South China Sea problems is of course, in the mind of policymaker, as you represented in your panel. However, I want to know more about public opinion or how South China Sea resonate with people in your countries in the panel. Thank you.
Honestly, that's not really part of this discussion. And so far, it's only indirectly affected. So thank you for answering my question. They may not get to your question. In the interim, Professor Do, can you repeat your last comment? We had some questions about what you were asking.
My very last questions? Yeah, so I mean that we need to be, it's possible that we could go to some specific thing, even now with, raise a protest opposition to, the Nine-Dash-Line claim, to the foreshare claim, to the anti-violent acts, without mention. I mean, of course, we're not against China, but we're against such unlawful claims and actions. Yeah.
Okay. Why don't we start at the other end? And Jennifer, you want to lead us off?
Great. Look, thank you so much for those questions. Given the time we've had, I'll address two of them. I know it wasn't directed to me, but the question about capacity building versus sovereignty. Look, I think it's a really good question. There's been a lot of programs that have been rolled out across the globe to countries where they're not sustainable programs, they're not cost-effective programs, and in the end, they don't provide a capability. And there's a number of examples in this room, including, China's provision of patrol boats to East Timor, which is a classic example of a capability that didn't really work. I think understanding what that country actually needs and making sure you're not just providing the capability, but you're providing the sustainment and support behind it, and helping them become more independent in that is a way to approach it. In terms of the question about the Royal Australian Navy, look, Joseph, thank you. I know that you follow my podcast, or you've probably seen my views on it. I would highlight, though, as much as the Royal Australian Navy in terms of numbers of ships is reaching an all-time low in terms of surface combatants, there's a question when you talk about naval strategy in terms of not only numbers of ships, but also the capability of those ships. And the Royal Australian Navy is a fairly high-tech, certainly comparable regionally Navy, but again, when you think about naval strategy and credibility of a country, it goes broader than just the number of ships that are operating in the region. It also is about the capacity building programs you support, the diplomatic engagement you support, the statements of support that Australia has been consistent in providing the Philippines. So I think that there is, despite the reduction in surface combatants in the Royal Australian Navy, certainly the evidence shows that that hasn't shown any disengagement in this region. In fact, there is more engagement, and I think that will continue to be the trend.
Thanks. So to John's question, look, yes, there would obviously be divisions in how Southeast Asian states vote in any UN vote. Philippines, obviously, yes. Singapore, yes. In all likelihood, Indonesia and Vietnam, yes. The current representative of Myanmar, who's an NLD appointee, would be yes. Of the other five, the only one that falls beneath the very conservative threshold that I use in my modeling would be Laos to maybe vote no, but I think that's probably an abstain. So assume all other five abstain. Have you learned anything you didn't already know? I mean, Foreign Minister Hassan stood up at the ASEAN Regional Forum this year and publicly blamed the Philippines for getting its own teeth kicked in. So I don't think that's going to widen the divisions that are already yawning in ASEAN. If anything, it helps take the burden off of ASEAN, because the less the Philippines try to shoehorn an issue in to the ASEAN agenda on which it will never get support, the better. I will respect the request to skip the Trump question. On Rocco's question on island building and fishing, so yes, obviously digging up the reefs that fish spawn on is highly destructive. The island building, though, even if you add up all of what China's done in the Spratlys, the Paracels, plus Vietnam's more recent island building, you get to, I'll ballpark it at 6,500 acres, maybe. China dug up over 21,000 acres from clam harvesting. So that's the more destructive practice. I mean, Hainan poachers under the eye of the CCG have engaged in the most widespread intentional destruction of coral reef in human history. That's the real ecocide here, not the island building. The island building's bad, but it actually pales in comparison to the thing we don't talk about as much, which was the intentional clam poaching so people could get rich selling statuary and illegally harvested jewelry on Chinese online marketplaces. What to do about it? There's not a lot. I mean, it could be one option for a second arbitration. It's certainly the one that the DFA and DOJ here talked about the most. The collection of evidence is very, very difficult, as Jay Batang Bakal reminded me earlier today. As for the actual management, there's almost no hope of this going through an ASEAN context. I mean, it's one of the early harvests that's been there since the 2002 DOC with no progress. So the only real hope of a fisheries management regime would be a claimants-only fisheries management regime. And that probably starts just with the Philippines, Indonesia, and Vietnam for the same reasons I just pointed out. Malaysia is not in a position to play ball under the current government.
My understanding is 20 years ago, 550 million people depended on the resources of the South China Sea to survive. It seems to me that's a very powerful case to be made for limiting environment destruction at some point or another. Captain Faria?
Oh, yes. Just responding to the Professor Kanehara's question. Well, there are two ways to quickly, or to build the capacity. For example, in case of submarine piracy, Japanese government decided to deploy a GMSDF asset and a JSDF asset in total. I mean, the destroyers and the aerial asset to the region, and this is very quickly supplement the regional maritime security capability because we have dispatched capable ships to the scene to counter piracy operations. This is very quickly. However, this is, as Professor Kanehara correctly pointed out, actually not respecting the sovereignty of the coastal state. However, in case of submarine piracy, because the most of submarine piracy cases occurred within or outside of the territorial sea of any state, in the EEZ or the high seas. So there is no sovereignty issues in deploying Japanese asset in Gulf of Aden. On the other hand, what if what Japanese government did to or doing to Southeast Asia? The most of piracy cases, or I would say the armed robbery cases in Southeast Asia, is within the territorial sea or even the archipelagic waters that is under sovereignty of the coastal state. In this case, the Japanese government and even the Coast Guard is not going to deploy our Coast Guard asset or the JMSDF or JSDF asset for law enforcement operation in considering for the sovereignty of the coastal state. Instead, we decide to train and educate the regional state so that they can, the regional state can maintain the legal order by themselves. That has not yet been covered by my brief presentation, so I thank you very much for pointing out a very important point. And then responding to the Mr. Espina's question, sorry for my pronunciation. Well, in case of Japan, we deter Chinese coercive activities around, Senkaku Islands by the Coast Guard confrontation. Japanese government sees the occasional or frequent intrusion into the territorial waters around Senkaku Island as a violation of international law because they are not observing or exercising right of innocent passage. So we respond by this violation by the law enforcement operations. This is somehow tricky. However, this is very useful tool to avoid a military conflict. So I think this is not always fully applied to the South China Sea because the asymmetry of the South China Sea regional states and your counterpart maybe China. However, the essence to avoid military conflict by police authority is one of the key that you may apply in the South China Sea. So the regional coastal states are increasing the Coast Guard asset. And also...
Yeah, I'm sorry, I've got a real hard stop.
I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Brahma, please.
The ASEAN-India joint exercise in the South China Sea was not the first time the Indian Navy exercised in the South China Sea. It's been doing that over a period of time, but I think it needs to be done more often to send a clear message. But India is also doing other things to help claimant states in the South China Sea. For example, to the Philippines, it has transferred anti-ship cruise missiles. The first batch came this spring, and another batch will come as soon as Philippines is able to complete ground facilities to house additional missiles. In addition, India is extending lines of credit to claimant states. There was an agreement in April to extend $300 million to Vietnam, for example. It's, this is all part of an effort to help states expand and upgrade their coastal defenses. But we have to also recognize that India is locked with China in its own South China Sea type of problem. The Chinese encroachments in the Himalayas on Indian borderlands created this military standoff, which is now in its 5th year, and the two countries have only recently reached an understanding to disengage, that is to end the eyeball-to-eyeball confrontations that were going on for more than 4 years. But the problem is very similar to what the problem that South China Sea claimant states face, encroachments. The difference is that those encroachments are on islets, rocks, reefs, and other places, geographic features, while India faces these land encroachments. But the problem parallels what Philippines, for example, is facing in its maritime backyard. I think that external players that have a stake in the South China Sea need to evolve a common strategy. That's been missing among the external players. The Quad can play a role, as being in the vanguard of helping to evolve a common strategy among the important external players. Unfortunately, under the leadership of President Biden, the Quad's focus shifted from Indo-Pacific to global challenges like climate change, cybersecurity, health security, etc. It's a 4-member grouping. It is in no position to deal with universal challenges. I trust that with the new administration taking office in Washington, the Quad's focus will shift back to the Indo-Pacific.
The last word.
I'm timing myself. I'm going to take 30 seconds. First of all, looking around the table, there's so many young faces, and I think it gives credit to the organizers, because this isn't about us, this is about you. This is on you, right? I'm going to be long retired when these problems are still around unless you do something about it. So the first thing is that this last round of questions had lots of the young people around the table chiming in, and I'm particularly grateful for that. But I wanted to touch upon something that you mentioned and Kahana-sensei mentioned, because it is at the heart of this question of cooperation. How do you find a balance between capacity building, cooperating, providing assistance, and actually interference? It's a really hard game. And going back, because I'm an academic, at the end of the day, I will always blow my own horn. And going back to the point I was making earlier about the Center of Excellence, having places that we come together from an intellectual point of view, where we go over the fundamental concepts and notions that we should then employ to understand each other's differences, I think that's exactly where you find that balance. You don't want to write someone else's destiny maritime security. You want to empower people with their own voice in order to write that destiny whilst they're exchanging views with others. That kind of place is a place that brings in multinational organizations, NGOs, all those stakeholders that might have different elements of maritime security that from a government perspective, that particular point in time, it's not convenient to talk about, but it has to be talked about. Sea level rises are not going to go away, right? Gender inequalities and maritime security are not going to go away. So that's why, looking across the room, I can only say thank you very much, everyone, for the willingness to engage, for the type of questions, and definitely I can see how from now on, moving forward, there is a genuine opportunity to increase understanding and starting that conversation over greater resilience through reciprocal engagement rather than just confrontation and contestation. Thank you.
He didn't do that in 30 seconds. First of all, so first, everyone please join me in thanking the panelists. My apologies to the 3 speakers that didn't get a chance. We have one more session. I'm sure your question, you can slot it into that one. And finally, I want to apologize for being as rude as I've been, but 2 of our panelists have a very hard departure and have to leave immediately, so that's why we have got to end this session now. Thank you all very much. Short break, 15 minutes, and then I believe we're here for the last session at 3:45.
Thank you very much, sir. May we request for a quick photo, sir, before we conclude the panel, and of course, the break may now start as well. Thank you very much. All right, let's pose for a quick photo. Thank you very much for our panel. and of course, our panel chair. Thank you very much, ma'ams and sirs. And now we'll proceed to our last break. And of course, please be back by 3:45 as we continue with the last panel for this event. Thank you very much.